especially to Ms. Emiko Kawaguchi and to Mr. Robert Dujaric for all of their assistance. Thank you very much to everyone for coming, especially those of you from Harvard Club of Japan and the Temple University community. I think you're in for a very interesting presentation. So the speaker tonight, Dr. Ishinami, is a professor of Japanese at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She's come to us all the way from Boston via Nagoya University. She earned her PhD at Nagoya, where she was a Mungu Kagakusho scholar. And during that time, she compiled more than 200 hours of audio clips of Japanese students that were part of her research. And we're lucky that tonight we're going to have the chance to hear some of those audio clips. Not all 200 hours. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Judy Ishinami.
Thank you. And thanks so much to ENCO for having me and for Temple University for hosting this event, and especially to Cliff and Robert Dujaric for having the Harvard Club of Japan's relationship to the Reischauer Institute is one that I came to know through Carl Kay, who's a member of the Reischauer Institute in Japan, and he asked me if I might be interested in coming and speaking on my research here, and I jumped at the opportunity. It's wonderful to see so many people have shown up. I'm thrilled that you're all here. I'd like to ask if you could candidly just sort of say if you consider yourself a native speaker of Japanese, could you raise your hand if you consider? Doesn't matter what anybody else thinks about you. Okay. And if you consider yourself a learner, maybe a lifetime learner, or once having learned Japanese, Japanese, could you raise your hand, please? Okay, so it's a pretty balanced crowd, I think, and some people didn't raise their hands, so that side's good. Well, without further ado, I'd like to get right into the topic of the discussion that I have planned for you, which is talking about native speaker reactions to American learners' speech. And specifically, I designed a study to look at polite and plain form speech styles. We're talking about des mas style and the style of speech that ends without using the des mas form, so the plain form, okay? So I'll show you some, you'll be able to hear some examples of that. But I wanted to give you first some of the technical background information that you need so that you can understand what's going on in the study. And the motive for this study, which is that generally speaking, in classrooms at the university level in the United States and in Japan, the polite form is the form that's stressed for students to learn and to use in drills and to use in practice conversations. It's in textbooks, and you'll see it throughout the textbooks. And it's considered the safe form. It's sort of non-objectionable is the rationale for doing that. Well, I wondered if that was really the case. And there are many, there's a history of these kinds of attitude studies of native speaker reaction. They were quite popular in the 1980s, and then they sort of dwindled away for a number of good reasons, and some that are more just that it's very complex information to sort of sort through. So I wanted to design a study that would look at different groups of Japanese native speakers and how they responded to polite and plain form speech, because I had a hunch that my Japanese as a second language learner was not the same as the Japanese that my classmates and my friends at my university were using. I caught on to that quite quickly. I was using the polite form, and even to this day, if I'm really concentrating on what I'm trying to say, even if you're one of my very best friends, you'll find me sort of starting to talk in the polite form. And it's sort of a result of having made that sort of automatic, what you pay attention to as a habit. Where has the emphasis been in your learning? And I think that probably because of the adult learning status of university students, that's why the safe form is considered the polite form. And you'll find that the reaction to that isn't exactly consistent throughout groups. And so that's what I want to show you today. In my research, what I did was I targeted initially 3 groups. Workers, that is people working in the local community, in different jobs, undergraduate students, and teachers of Japanese. And being in Japanese language education studies, I was able to find 92 teachers who would participate, all teachers at the university level who would participate in this study, and 200 undergraduate students. I collected data from 8 learners of Japanese. They are American learners of Japanese, all residing in the United States, and the data, the speech samples were collected from them while they were in the United States and enrolled in Japanese programs in the United States. So throughout this speech, you'll find me, this talk I'll be referring to teachers, meaning the teachers of Japanese, the undergraduates, meaning the undergraduate native speakers of Japanese, and the students generally will be referring to the 8 American students who participated by way of getting audio samples, only audio, there was no video associated to this study. Okay, so then after collecting these 8 samples, the students were tested for their level of proficiency based on the actual proficiency scale. Now that's outside of the scope of this study. There is a way we can look at that data and compare what we think and what native speakers and what Japanese teachers think, for example, what undergraduates think about those same people compared to how actual, if you're familiar with the American Council for the Teaching of Foreign Languages, how they have their oral proficiency or interview and how they scored the students. But that's, again, they were all basically intermediate students, intermediate, medium to intermediate, high-level students. So that was controlled for. What they were asked to do was to perform a one-on-one role play with a pretend friend, a 21-year-old female by the name of Nozomi, a native Japanese speaker who was studying in the United States. And in their role play, they were to talk to Nozomi in the situation of having a casual conversation in the cafeteria over lunch and talking about spring break or last weekend. And those topics were chosen because I wanted to make sure that their ability to access the vocabulary and express themselves, being intermediate level speakers, wasn't going to be a big issue, so that they could express themselves. So I didn't choose I wasn't trying to actually feel out what level they were actually at. I wanted to know what they would do in a normal situation. What did you do last night? What did you do over the weekend? What are you going to do over spring break? So that's what the content is of these samples that you will hear. And you have the survey that was distributed to the 200 undergraduate students and the 92 teachers of Japanese who participated in this study. I think that pretty much summarizes the details of what happened with the study. What I'd like you to do is have a listen to these 2 samples, and if you could, I'm going to let you listen to prompts 6 and 7. And so maybe just because of the format of the paper you have, maybe like on the left margin, there are actually 9 questions. You can see Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3 on the left, and then under 4, which is a section, you have 5 questions, and 5 is a final question. So there's a total of 9 questions. They're all. I guess if you can't, should we go over what the different questions are? We should. Let's give that a shot. Make sure that you know what they are, especially so that you can you can answer these specific questions of relevance for this. No? No? Well, while we're working on it, let me just basically go through them, if I could, with you briefly. Question number one is asking you if you were the Japanese friend in this situation and you were spoken to this way, how would you feel? Okay, so it's an affective question, it's affective measure, 1 through 4. 1 is, I wouldn't like it. And 4 being, I would like it a lot. Notice there's no mid-score, there's no midpoint. So you can't say, well, I wouldn't really feel one way or another. That was intentional. Each question was worded a little differently, and the scales were chosen to tailor to the particular question, not to just make it all on a scale of 1 to 7, which led later in the analysis, of course, to difficulties, but I think it's the right approach to take. Number 2, in this speech is the way that the foreign student speaking, shitashi, is it friendly, or is it yoso yoso shi, so it's establishing a distance? Which kind of impression is it giving in terms of the listener, which is nozomi, their friend? And question number 3, it's if you were in this situation and you were this 21-year-old Japanese girl, nozomi, how would you like the person, how would you like this American to speak to you? Would you like them to speak from 1 to 7, 1 being a lot more casually, and then more casually, a little bit more casually, and then this is a good level, and then going in the other direction of 5, 6, 7, a little bit more politely, and much more politely. So those are the 3 main questions that I was looking at on the left, and on the right, it is a similar CAS scale that is under section 4. Question number 1 is on comprehension. Was it easy to understand? 1 being yes, I think so, and 5 being I don't think so for each question. Number 2, was there use of grammar in the speech? Were there many mistakes? Number 3, excuse me. Do you think that the foreigner's speech in this situation was appropriate? Number 4, was the foreigner's speech fluent? And number 5, does this foreigner's speech really sound like a foreigner? Is it pronunciation, a question about pronunciation? And then the very last question is to give an overall evaluation from 1 meaning bad, 3 meaning in the middle, and 5 meaning good. How would you evaluate the speaker's way of speaking overall? Okay. So notice there's the question number 1, the first question and the last question. The first question is considered effective. The last question is considered evaluative. And the difference is supposedly that these are different measures. And so this is a fascinating topic, I think, because you can't just, not all languages make it so clear that you have something that's different between polite and plain speech that's encoded linguistically, that we can just look at and say, oh, well, this should have an effective, a different way, an effect on the way that the listener feels. I mean, if you're using polite speech, if one considers politeness to be an effective related measure, which we'll look at a little bit later, well then Japanese is a great example for how we can actually investigate whether that's the case. Because there are those who argue that they're 2 different things. Evaluative measures and effective measures are different. So that was another part of some work that I did in my thesis. Okay, great. So I'd like to just play a couple of samples, and if you just want to write 6 maybe on the left-hand side and 7 on the right-hand side, and try to go through and give us a score quickly to each of these samples. They're about 1 minute long each. So I'm going to play track. I think that track 6 is actually.
次は場面7です。
Okay, sorry. Track 6. Okay, so
次は
answer what you think, especially about those 5 questions, that is questions 1 through 3, and the last question, that's 4, and then there's a question on appropriateness that's a line in the graph. Number. Well, it's a little bit different map. But we'll look at that.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean. Well, now, I've given you a lot of information. I mean, the participants in the study, they didn't know that I was looking at, feelings versus evaluative. I mean, they were, wonderful volunteer participants, and that's it. So they didn't really analyze it, and in fact, they were given 1 minute to evaluate each. There was a short briefing, there's a short introduction, short conclusion. I think the whole survey took no more than 20 minutes to go into a room, do the survey, and leave. So I collected all of my data within a very short time, a couple of weeks. Okay, so we'll move on to the next prompt. Go ahead, you can go ahead and circle some, or put some numbers, rate this, this is speaker number 7. And then I'd like you to just take a second and maybe jot down somewhere on the paper, on the back, or in your mind, or wherever. What do you think, in evaluating these speakers, or in answering these questions in general, how it made you feel? In general, what was your impression? What of these components, or of some other component that maybe I didn't include on the paper that you have in your mind, what do you think most determines your reaction to the foreigner's speech? Maybe just jot that down on the paper. You can choose from one of my questions. You can make something else up if that's what you want to do. What I just want to see what you think it might be in your opinion. That's that you're listening for. And then I'd like you to take a minute or two to just talk to the person next to you and see what they say. And I'm going to kind of walk around and hear what you're saying. That's all right.
I thought their Japanese was very maybe intermediate, probably about the same as the people. Especially David. It took a while to get
Why?
You can tell when it's going to walk over a
Either way.
I mean, I guess native Japanese speaker, conversation with
You sit down. Okay, you sit here. It's okay.
I'm really glad to see that everybody likes this question. I think it's a great question also, and I'd like to know, just see here some volunteers, some answers. Anybody? Did anybody agree with the people they were talking to? Did you come to a consensus? Yes. What did you agree with?
The key to whether it was appropriate or not was the situation, and was there supposed to be a distance between the two speakers?
Okay. Do you think that the appropriateness of that you sensed in the sample was very important? Was that really important to you in evaluating, or the way you felt about it? Is that what that's what you're saying? I'm afraid that maybe I've biased your sample because you know what the survey was supposed to be about, but that's okay.
If
So you
I
say
was
appropriateness.
Nozomi's mother, I would think that the young man was being appropriate. Yeah,
All right.
and whereas two women talking to each other, yeah, that's also appropriate.
Okay, so the appropriateness. Well, there's one of the most important studies that has ever been done in Japanese. There are very few native speaker reaction studies, but one was performed by Okamura I think it was published in 1998 in, I believe, the Modern Language Journal. And teachers felt that appropriateness was the most important factor in the way that they were judging students who participated in a similar type of study, just so you know. Other people said that. And what else, did anybody else come by? Yes?
I thought the second conversation was very unnatural by the Japanese context, meaning that she was rather casual and he was very formal. From the context of, because again, we don't know what the context of these people are meeting, other than the conversation, so that in the Japanese context, there's senior versus junior persons, and more the higher level person versus lower level person's language usage. And at the same time, there's a concept of mirroring. In other words, you mirror the style to get closer. So from the mirroring standpoint, it was quite obvious that he didn't want to synchronize with the speaker. And so, not knowing the context was rather odd.
Right. Well, he they knew the context. Nozomi knew the context. She didn't know exactly what it was all about, but she knew she was supposed to go and speak with each student about the same content, talk like a friend, and be consistent with each student. And I think she did a pretty good job of that. There are a few, I think that she was probably taken back a little bit too when she was spoken to this way. But she held her ground and she kept being friendly, you know? So she did a good job. But the only question, the questions in the survey, particularly number 3, says if you were this 21-year-old Japanese girl, how would you want to be spoken to? So that context is clear. And in the introduction, it says you're about to hear a conversation between a Japanese native speaker, Nozomi. She's 21, a university student. She's in the cafeteria. She'll be talking with her friend, an American student who's learning Japanese, about the weekend or spring vacation. So that context was given to you, the participant, in this. And keeping in mind, the target of this survey is not really so much the American, or it's not just the American speakers, but it's the Japanese native speaker. What do they think? So, yes?
You may question.
Yes.
I think since 6 hours is the first conversation ready. The speech speaks better than the man. The reason is first, I think I think his Japanese ability is not so good. So he didn't voluntarily make his opinion.
Okay. What makes you think his Japanese is not so good? Why do you say that?
Okay. She said he pauses,
Okay.
and his pronunciation is okay, but I think his pitch or accent is kind of weird for Japanese people. Yeah. And she, or the first speaker, so 6, she speaks more fluently, and she voluntarily speak. So perhaps he pauses. So Naomi-san or something. I forget her name, but she asks, where did you go, Mori or something, did you go to Mateo or Rivera or something? And no, I'm Mori. But the Mori, we say Mori or something. The word, each word, when each word not pronunciation but speech or accent is kind of weird.
I think that that's interesting because there is something about pronunciation. I think that the pronunciation feeds into fluency. I think that fluency, is across studies, across these kinds of studies of foreign language speakers, learners of not just Japanese. Fluency does tend to be higher up there on the list in terms of properties of the speech sample that influence the attitudes. Yes?
I want to ask you a question. For example, when we study English, of course, and pronunciation, accent, of course, when we read the textbook, accent and pronunciation, just by reading, I can understand. There's a mark or something, But of course, there is a pronunciation, something, but how's the pitch? And just by listening, we learn. So, his talking is not pronunciation, but accent. Or accent we Japanese, we don't emphasize accent so when we run.
Accent. The
Accent.
accent is a different type
Pitch.
of.
Pitch.
Is there any other, is there anybody else who,
I got a native speaker right next to me, and she said that the first one, like it wasn't about the. I don't need it. My voice is pretty loud, right? But the first one, it wasn't like both of them. It wasn't the speech that they were using. It wasn't polite versus impolite. It was the enthusiasm.
oh,
she said.
enthusiasm. Wow. Now that would almost be and how would one measure that through speech?
Well, I know from where I'm sitting, like the first one, like I was like picturing the two people talking in my head, and I could see the girl like smiling and laughing and all that and getting into the conversation. But the second one, the guy seemed like a little cerebral, so
He was right. He was really monitoring. I mean, I think he was really. By the way, just so you know, they're the exact. As per Actful, they were exactly the same level. Just so everybody knows.
that's all.
Yeah, yeah.
On your comment, as I was mentioning to you earlier, we're in the midst of testing American students of Japanese at the institute I run. And we have a term for that, or the Japanese teachers do, and they call it involvement. You show good involvement in the conversation, which we use
Nice.
to test you. And that's really, I think, the enthusiasm that perhaps you were referring to.
Nice. Right, and I would add just that the enthusiasm that you participate, it can be limited by lack of skill. So that's why when you're really in the beginning stages of language learning, I mean, still enthusiasm can go very far, but you can become frustrated much more easily. A couple more comments.
I don't know how to relate this. I think the problem is something that
I think the problem with the native speakers is something that the Japanese call merihari. There's a kind of modulation that comes in a voice. And I don't know that I can do it in English, but I certainly know how to do it in Japanese. I don't know when you teach that, at what level.
Well, I think that you teach that throughout. I think there's not enough of teaching. I personally think there's just not enough of phonetic teaching of pronunciation and phonetic awareness, especially at the lowest levels where the learner can't really do that much with the language. You can do a lot with getting them used to practicing the sounds of the new sounds and practicing the accent and practicing merihari and using poems and using music. And even if all they can do is maybe know what some of the words and the materials they're using, they're not going to be highly productive speakers or writers at that stage anyways. So I encourage that early on, even if they don't know what it is they're saying. Okay? Yeah.
So I just kind of a question of clarification thought with a comment. So you're saying that by some, what's called ACTA stand? Sorry, I think
Oh yeah, the American
these two are exactly
Council of
right.
Yeah, right.
So they were evaluated?
By the proficiency, okay? It's a proficiency standard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
this seems ridiculous. What struck me as odd about that, assuming that they are essentially on the same level, is that most people seem to be saying that the second guy didn't come across as proficient. And this is, I don't have this thought fully formed in my head yet, but it seemed to me with the girl who was more enthusiastic and seemed to be getting along better, like one of the things I noticed was when she was describing the homework and she was describing the test that was coming up. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I thought it was vague to the Japanese listener as to whether or not she was saying that the period of time she was studying with the homework was difficult because, it was long and boring or whatever, or that the test that she was studying for was difficult.
Right.
But
that's comprehension.
yeah, but the Japanese person kind of just went like, oh yeah, just kind of rolled with it.
Right.
And so I think it kind of gave the impression that the Japanese listener was just rolling with it, when in a way she was glossing over the mistakes, giving the American woman the impression, maybe both to us and to her, of being more fluent than the guy was, or than maybe she actually was. If I could just sort of finish up with this sort of tail end comment, that to me that sort of seems to be sort of a precursor of what I kind of sort of think is a middle zone of Japanese study, which is as you get better, you sort of hit a level where you start to get closer and closer to getting across your actual point, so that the Japanese people tend to kind of roll with it, and they stop correcting you, and they can give you the impression that your level is higher than it is. And I kind of thought that was what was going on with this, with the female American student.
Okay. I guess the only thing I would say is that when you're guessing what the person means, that's a comprehension. And it could be comprehension problem on the part of the listener, or it could be something that's actually in the speech, a wrong word choice, an error.
Which native speakers do too.
Right, which native speakers do as well. So I want to just hold up, just show you a little bit what the actual results were. For the ranking, actually, okay, that's not the right one. For the overall evaluation, what teachers thought was most important, or what was most significant, included the appropriateness, tekisetsusa, namerakasa, fluency, and the pronunciation were all predictor variables. Okay. Now I have some correlations that I could talk about a little bit more as well. This is a very superficial kind of presentation of the data, but just to let you know what was out there. For the undergraduates, the feeling that they were being spoken to, that they were friendly, was significant, as was appropriateness. And I believe that fluency was probably significant. I'm not entirely sure. I think that the level of significance is very borderline here at 0.014. I probably would, given the large sample, I probably wouldn't say that. I would probably leave that alone. But take it as a whole population with the Japanese, and there were also working people who were poor, and undergraduates. Fluency showed up to be significant. But interestingly, there is comprehension, which is significant in this study for the undergraduates. Now, comprehension is question number 1. 外国人の学生の話していることが日本人に分かりやすいと思いますか? That's a comprehension question. And vocabulary has been shown to be very highly correlated with comprehension. I did not ask a question specifically about vocabulary on this survey, which I could have, but I didn't want to make it too overly technical about vocabulary, since the correlation between vocabulary and comprehension has been established in previous studies. Okay? And if you want some references on that, I can get that information to you. In a larger sense, there an overall correlative study of all of the, I think it was 278 people, showed that basically all of the factors that were looked at were marginally, significantly, in other words, not a high level of significance, but a lower level of correlation strength, somewhere between the 0.2 and 0.6 range. 0.2 being really quite low enough that you probably should overlook it, except for that it's consistent. It's throughout all of these, especially the questions on the right-hand side. You know, pronunciation, fluency. Fluency was a little bit stronger. It tended to be the highest correlated with the overall evaluation, as well as the affective response, somewhere at a p-value. This is at a p-value of 0.05. And then it was all adjusted for using Bonferroni's adjustments for you have to divide it by each time you're running the same test and so on. but a correlation between overall evaluation and fluency of 0.68 is pretty, it's pretty good. That's pretty strong. There's probably something there. But for example, pronunciation, grammar, 0.395, 0.317, 0.299. They're all significant, but just sort of across the board. Now, what I wanted to sort of focus on next, if everybody is okay with moving forward just for the time being here, is going back to the initial assumptions of this study, which is that, is there any basis in the first place for dividing polite and non-polite speech samples, and for assuming that that's going to have some kind of an affective or evaluative influence? In other words, and sort of in support of this larger correlation result that I just announced, it really depends. It depends on the speaker. And so, the bottom line in the very first analysis, the first thing that you'll see, if I were not to have told you anything about this study and being about polite and plain form speech, and you were not to have taken this survey, you would probably say, well, it really depends on who I'm talking to. It really depends. What matters most to me really depends. So you've told me a number of different things. That's a little surprised. So that's an example of using the plain form word, even though he was using the plain form. Can somebody explain what, he wasn't rated very well. The undergraduates wanted him to speak a little more politely in some cases, not to a significant extent. The teachers definitely wanted him to speak more politely, and it was significant. And the difference between the teachers and the undergraduates, I didn't look at it specifically for him, but I don't believe it was significant. But does anybody have any comment on that last sample? Yeah.
Yeah, comparing with the examinee number 6, the first one, the lady.
Yeah.
As somebody mentioned to the examinee number 7, a gentleman, before this one, I couldn't feel the passion. In addition to that, he's using the plain form. That gap makes the weird impression.
It's hard. I mean, in some sense, they didn't really. I mean, not trying to make excuses for them, but they go in. These were totally spontaneous. They had no idea what they were going to be asked to do. They volunteered. I think they were paid $10 to participate in the study, and they sat down. And one girl really became very nervous and had to drop out just because she didn't. I mean, it's not a real difficult, but it's stressful to suddenly sit down and be given a cue card and say, okay, could you please, talk. There was no rehearsal, no prior knowledge of the topic.
I don't say that those examinees are bad. I say that their output causes that kind of impression. That's the reason. Yes.
You can hear it.
As I have explained.
Yep, I think you're right. I totally agree. So that's something that, how would you work that into? That's one of those, that's something that's what accounts for it all depends. Okay, that's one more factor that accounts for it all depends. But still, even though it does all depend, plain and polite form speech do make a difference depending on the group. The encoding does make a difference for politeness. So, what else, anything else about that speech sample that caught anybody's attention? Yeah.
But politeness is part of the language in Japanese language. Politeness has different levels.
Yes. I looked only at this one particular.
Okay, so there is politeness when you look at somebody as high than yourself, and there is politeness when you see somebody at the same level, and there is another level in which you see somebody that you can talk down to some person. That's involved. That's part of the Japanese language. So when I am spoken this way, in either of these ways, I have to adapt myself to the way I'm being spoken.
Right. I would agree. I would agree, but what's interesting is that you can do that by teaching and by having students practice and use polite in plain form. That's one thing that they can learn to use consciously to navigate and to express their distance or closeness. I mean, you could say, well, we can teach pronunciation too, but naturally, I mean, you're not going to really teach a bad pronunciation. You're not going to encourage that. So this particular encoding of politeness, and I'm just looking at Decimas form. I'm not talking about Kenjo or something. None of that was involved in any of this.
Okay, but would you say that teaching the polite form, like this and as, that would be a kind of obstacle for the learners? In which way that would be a kind of obstacle?
Okay, well, I'll conclude with my part of what I wanted to say basically with that. In a couple of ways. First of all, because their peers who are of the same age clearly showed a preference for plain form speech in the situation that was given to them.
But because they are the same age.
Okay, so the majority of the relationships, or not maybe even the majority of the relationships, but some of the relationships that young people want to make are going to be with their peers. So if they want to make relationships with their peers, it's one of the things you can do very early on. You can't give them everything because they're not capable of processing the entire language and at the same time entirely handling all sociolinguistic situations. But they can use the plain and polite form at the end of sentences, at the end of very simple utterances, and that's one reason why. And the other reason why is that it's something that they have to get used to doing, so that when they're very, very good speakers of Japanese, which some people might even say that I'm a very good speaker of Japanese, but when I'm really, like I was saying, when I'm really, suddenly I've come out with the most bizarre polites. I'll be using itashimashite or something like that to a friend in a very strange situation, and it's kind of funny. And it's just a habit, and that happens when I'm concentrating on the content of what I want to say, or I'm trying to recall a word. So there are processing constraints. So if you can make that more automatic, oh, I'm in this situation with friends, I'm going to use this, and you teach that, and it's quite easy, and it's also the natural way to teach in a classroom, because these are students who go through 4 years of a university program in the same class, 4 years together, every day. In fourth year Japanese, they're still talking to each other about the weekend using the polite form. That's not natural. And then they come to it's not. And then they come, yeah, and in many cases they're already good friends. Yeah. So, but it does all depend. But we always can say that it does all depend. So I mean, isn't that nice? Yes.
Question. I sort of had an experience recently where I was speaking to sort of a Ketsuke person at a bank, and I'm really bad at Keigo and that kind of thing. So I asked them if they could speak sort of more plainly and not use Keigo, and that completely flustered them. I kind of realized that I basically asked them, said, could you be more rude to me? Like, can you verbally abuse me a bit? I'd like that. So the thing was, up until this point, I kind of always thought of like Keigo and mass forms and all this stuff as being kind of modular. Like you switch modes and you kind of put on the mass form, or you turn on the Keigo. But now I'm kind of wondering if it's more like a gradient. Like in English, if I want to be more polite, I tend to spend longer saying things. So instead of, do you have the time, I'd say, excuse me, please, could you tell me the time? And I'm wondering, is it actually the case that Japanese is like that, but they just have more sort of, they just have terms for these levels of tonight. Do you see me like it actually is more of a gradient, but they just have ways of describing it?
There are definitely gradients, and there's different ways. At that level, it's lexical. I mean, the choice of verb is different depending on.
Right.
Depends on but that's a different. There's
putting
yourself lower than the person.
Right. But did they kind of come in sets in a way? You know what I mean? Like sort of bump up, almost sort of in a discrete level to another.
Yes, I think that the systems are pretty well established, and you can study the systems. And again, I recommend Kikuchi Yasuto's book called Keigo. I think it was republished a couple of years ago, but in like 1999, 2002. I highly recommend that. It will teach you the major 3 or 4 systems that you would know. So even within politeness in terms of des mas form, there is another kind of politeness that has a similar effect that's sort of a super politeness. But then there's also humble speech and honorable speech, honorifics, respectful speech. So when you mix polite speech with the honorific system, you get super effects. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? In English and foreign language, usually can say when you can say talk proprietary, speak proprietary, you add some word like say Mr. or would you like or something? No.
I think that
Add something.
yeah, Brown and Levinson, they're very good studies, comprehensive studies on the sentence length and its relationship to and auxiliary verbs in English and their relationship. I'm actually not really specialized in English that way, but yes, that is something that you do in English. But I think it would be harder to do this kind of study in English. I think it's easier in Japanese because of the encoding is so salient. The polite and plain form is so salient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a sense, I suppose, I think I like your point that it would be good to teach the less polite plain forms because the salience is a tool that could actually make communication more easy. But if we're in the question bit, I have 2 questions I'd like to ask you. One is about cross-language comparisons with other languages that have similar morphological components like Korean, where these days in Seoul, the best teaching materials, you start out with na instead of chol. Anyway, you refer to yourself in a way that in the diplomatic business, we used to teach diplomats, you will never use this plain form in your whole life, so we don't teach it, which meant, of course, you could never understand what the peasant was saying, because they would never use the more polite form.
And then you never got offered dinner.
That's exactly right. So, and then the connected that is, what do you do when you're speaking to children, where using the polite forms is actually adequate?
How do teachers teach children?
No, as a non-native speaker, if you have to interact with children, whether they be as a teacher, or whether they be children of friends, or whether they be neighbors, and you're using excessively polite forms to them.
How do they react? I don't, yeah. It's funny, I mean, I don't really know how children react entirely. I think it's fun. I think you can play with children with the polite form. I think they respond to that just like they do to their own parents, their mother's speech when their mother is mock plain, whatever. And one thing I have to say is as I've grown older, I've noticed that actually there are some people who do use polite speech between the husband and wife, even in younger generations. So among my friends, there are people who use polite speech towards their spouses, not consistently, not just, but at times. So, but I don't think that children. I think that children will use that in play. I think they'll mock, but a native speaker probably knows much better. I don't really know.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm actually a junior high school teacher, and I can tell you that if you go into the classroom and start using polite Japanese in front of a group of junior high Japanese students, they will laugh you out of the room. It's very inappropriate. You will lose all your authority right there. But actually, I thank you very much for your interest in that. I just have a question about gender.
Yes.
So I really want to go back to the second audio clip that you showed us.
Okay.
Where there was a boy speaking in Nozomi.
Right.
And he was there was various comments about where he was wrong. I mean, some people were saying that his pitch was mistaken. But one thing that really stuck out for me was that he was using mas, the polite form, and the Pedagogical, in sort of plain form and polite form use interchanging, going back and forth between them.
I thought it was 100%, no?
I think it's mostly polite.
Yeah,
It was
I thought
mostly
I think
polite,
it was
but-
100%. But he may have, some people said Ahsoka, but, okay.
Yeah, so my question was mainly about his using polite form. Obviously, he's a guy, and he's talking to a girl. I mean, judging by their voice tone, they seem to be the same age. I mean, I'm a graduate of TUJ, and so I've heard tons of conversations like this where kids just in the cafeteria. You have the foreign guy who's talking to a Japanese girl. He's speaking in mass form, and she's speaking in sort of just normal, everyday, plain speech. And just, I sort of, that's the thing that really sticks out for me as being mistaken. When I hear that the person is, I don't think it's really reasonable to expect a foreigner to grasp the pitch differences, but the difference between him being a man and a man's sort of using polite form, which is not, I mean, traditionally in Japan, polite form is very feminine. And him using that to talk to a woman, it just seems very,
No, that's wrong. That's not feminine. Excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm native speaker, so it's not.
I think that it has to do with, there are regional differences, but one of the things that's not even taken into consideration here is that for men, I think that I don't think that American learners of Japanese male speakers are taught that, you know, raising your voice and like talking at a generally higher pitch is not good. No, the opposite is polite. It's polite to, you know, arigatou gozaimashita. You know, it's not. Women can raise the overall tone. For men, it does not have that. And I think that is one of the things that this speaker is doing is he's trying to be friendly by doing it the way you do it in English, which is that men also raise their overall level of intonation or pitch.
But
my question, I was about to get to my question.
He's talking not about the pitch, but he's talking about form, this form, and mass form. And that, he says that that's feminine.
No, I'm not particularly saying that. I'm just saying that of the people in your very large survey group, there are probably people that have certain notions about gender related to which type of form. I mean,
right.
And so I was just wondering if there's any way to engage that.
Yeah. Well, all I can say is that I did not look at that. I have the data to look at that. That's built into the study because in the repeated measure was the students were matched for by gender, by sex. So there were 2 plain form male speakers and 2 polite form male speakers in this study. There were 2 plain form females and 2 plain form polite form female speakers in the study. It's not a huge sample, but it's for people that I can look at. I can do that study if you'd like. We can look at that for the next one. It's a good question. It's a great question, and that's why I tried to control for that. That's why I controlled that factor. I had to keep collecting data until I found people who were matchable. Yes?
One of the groups that you examined for their reactions to these conversations, you said were community workers.
Yeah.
And you didn't speak at all about their reactions and what they seem to take as most important in either effective measure or, I forgot the other category.
Evaluative.
Evaluative. Can you say just a few words about that?
Yeah, I think that for politeness overall, I think that their trend was, for effective, I think they responded more like the undergraduates. They were not as critical as the teachers. For politeness, I'm not sure. I can't say a lot because I don't have the work in front of me. I don't have the group. It was the smallest of the groups. I think 50 or 60 people, and there was nothing. When I did the initial analysis, I did look at the data, and because I wanted to focus on undergraduates and I wanted to find out more, something to help my colleagues and myself in teaching Japanese. I looked at these 2 groups, but there was nothing that was outstanding except for what I just mentioned that seemed to be, this is a particularly different case, but that but the affective was closer to the pattern that was shown by the undergraduates. I can look, that's another study.
A question that this plain form versus plain form. I don't know if you can make a comment about the reaction, but I noticed that when they do on television, like interviews of foreign sports figures, oftentimes they translate into Japanese language, and they always seem to use plain form, even though the native speaker is speaking rather politely, but they use rather plain form. So it seems like the Japanese expectation of the foreigners being always plain speaking. And
That is interesting.
yeah, so that seems like cultural expectations.
I think I know what you're.
If they're translating for a university professor, it becomes desmasu.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas the sports figures are always
Always plain.
That, yeah, that's
And
very
even though the native speaker is
Right,
rather speaking
right.
rather politely,
Right.
but translation is 100% casual plain form.
But as she mentioned, that when the academician's comments are translated, it's translated to
Yeah, but,
this
but with the Japanese
Yeah, actually,
expectation, how they're supposed to
So,
speak.
and the Japanese sports person, the Japanese sports people that I hear speaking, I speak politely to them.
Right, that's right.
So
The Japanese are
that-
sports
that's
figures
interesting.
speaking. Right. I don't know if there's any cultural issue or context in this. Japanese expectation.
Yeah. Did you always have the native speaker who was speaking to the foreign learner as a female speaking to them?
It was Nozomi, yes. She
Yeah.
did all of the.
Because I think you would have gotten some different responses if you had a male.
I think so too.
And I think that's what he would be referring to. It was okay for her to speak to him informally and have either a formal or informal response, whereas if he was speaking to a male, it would change the whole thing.
One of the things I think that I would say, I would agree with you, but one of the things that's also nice is that it's possible to go and do that. And to find 8 more speakers to speak with a male who is asked to do the same role play. And I also like the reproducibility of this study is very high. It's all very explicit, the method, the materials used, and how it was handled. So it can be done.
I want to ask a question. When I say you study from Japanese, when we study Japanese, usually we use writing expression. The idea is adding some expressions, some very correct expression. What? But I say when you want to study Japanese, I say. Perhaps I say you speak English, you do something, just add so when I say the idea is or perhaps same or similar, So when I say nani this, just add this. But the Japanese has a practice expression is different. Some of them are honorable expression, but I say we change some expression. Change or sometimes say. The verbs. There are say verbs or sometimes there.
Different.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's very difficult to say change or just only during conversation.
Right, but for this level of morphology, I mean the processing that goes on in order to produce a very not even really a grammatical sentence, but an utterance that, where the relationship between the participants and the verb is clear on what has you a whole what, at that level, it's very early in the acquisition process. Those are very simple words. There's no reason that in a context between, equal or friendly context, the learner, they have the resources to use to pay attention to the context and say, I need to use plain form now. So it's not always that complicated. There are stages, but in this given for intermediate level students in a cafeteria talking about the weekend, there's very little taxing on the memory, on recalling information. So.
No.
What's interesting is I don't think that any of these students were monitoring for their own politeness either, which I thought was really you know, of course, at that point of my research, I was very interested, so I was always monitoring other, you know, what were people using, and I still do, to a very high degree. And I monitor what I'm using as well at times, but I don't think they monitored at all. You know, and maybe because they were nervous, they just went with what was easiest for them, and it just so happened, you know, I had to collect more than 8 samples in order to get the you know, the balance that I needed for the design, but. And more of the samples were white speakers. Overall. Yeah.
Beyond the data, do you have any hunches or grand conclusions or things that come to you?
Well, just again that I think that it's, given what the reaction is, I think it's reasonable to say that politeness is related to the linguistic encoding. There are other things that are going on out there, but politeness, in terms of the des mas form or null or the plain form or using da as that copula, that linguistic encoding, it is perceived as politeness, and from that perspective, your group membership, depending on who you're speaking to, one or the other form is going to be preferred. So if you want to make an impression, then you should speak like a native speaker. Right? Well, the best way to speak Japanese is to speak it like a native speaker. That's true.
So if you were teaching Japanese, what should you start with?
I think that as a teacher of Japanese at the university level, I think it's fine to speak to your students using a mixture of both, depending on who you're speaking to. To the whole class, you would typically use. You should follow the. You should do the same thing that a Japanese professor.
But what would you teach that? What would you teach the students first? Would you teach them polite?
Well, I'd be speaking to them and giving them the directions, generally using polite form, because it would be a whole group. And then when they were asked to do something, they would be doing something with each other, and they would be using the plain form. And then when I asked them to tell me what so-and-so did over the weekend, and they're speaking back to me or they're speaking back to the class, they'd be using the polite form.
That's when they know both, and you're talking about the interaction. I'm asking, you've got a brand new group of Americans who don't know Japanese yet. You've got to start teaching them.
Right.
Would you teach them the polite form first, or
No.
would you teach them the casual form first?
I would teach them side by side, and I would allow them to make as much mistakes as they need to use until they have automaticity, until they have the automaticity going on. Because it's not wrong in the sense that we're not understanding, but it's wrong in the sense that it's really interfering with communication with the. And it can be wrong too, you know, it really can be, because sometimes you don't know who you're talking to. You're using, like, are you talking to me, or?
How long does it take, if you learn it in parallel, how long does it take?
I don't see any reason why it should take any, it certainly won't take any longer than it takes without teaching it. And but the thing is, as a practice, as a sound practice, you have to give them access to that language tool that they can use it with their classmates in the same class, with their peers.
In the outline of your presentation says that other factors, like higher order factors, also influence native speaker reaction. Could you elaborate, please, on what you refer to higher order factors?
It's all these things that show that it really depended on the speaker. That's the higher order. In other words, the speaker, the individual speaker, had a significant effect on the reaction. The individual speech samples themselves had an effect on the reaction.
Were you not talking about higher order thinking,
No, I really just mean at the highest order. In other words, each individual speaking. That's a fundamental sort of paradigm for using. It's not typically laid out that way in studies, and I wish it were explained a little more. But basically, just saying that, well, I've divided them based on plain and polite form, and so now we're going to compare groups. That's not good enough, because maybe the reason they don't like this particular speaker or another speaker is because of all these other reasons that you've given me. Those all do they matter. They matter significantly, and that's a higher order factor. It's not just error, it's a factor. But I believe that even though that is the case, the results show that plain and flight form do have differential effects on different groups. The groups respond to them differently.
Because when you say higher order, when you speak in Japanese, usually it's the listeners' responsibility to understand, not the speaker, which is different when you speak in English. So I was maybe thinking that you were talking about this kind of higher order.
I meant it really just in a statistical sense, the significance of the speaker. That's all really. So that we get. Yeah.
Because
But see,
when speaking in Japanese, it seems like you are being understood, but maybe the other person is doing only aisuchi.
right.
So in this case, it seems like you are being fluent, but actually you are being just giving aisuchi. So that's why I was thinking that maybe you were talking about different kinds of things.
Well, for Japanese learners, isn't it a convenient way to focusing on one way, because it could be also used for writing.
Right, there is, well, it's actually, the last sample, I mean, the writing is where the plain form comes in at the university level, and sort of starts, and there's a lot of confusion about, is the plain form the written form? I mean, I remember going through a stage where I used dearu when I was speaking. It's just really, because I didn't have da, or I didn't know how to use na or no, or different forms of the copula. So, I mean, I think that in writing, I think it's important to have students use the written style. And one of the best things that can be done is to have them writing diaries, because then they're going to use more of a spoken and intimate voice type of, and they won't be using plain form, nor will it be, overly literature-like. I don't know what the schedule is exactly here, but it's
I think this
should
could
be.
go all night.
Yeah, so I appreciate so much everybody coming in, your wonderful comments and questions and participation. Thank you so very much.